Okay, we're back live. Take it away.
Hey everyone, we're back. Next up is going to be Harley Geiger from Rapid 7, and he's going to be talking about why hacking is not always a crime. Harley?
That's right. Hi, everybody, fellow hacks. Let me share my screen here real fast. So thank you. Thank you very much for coming to my talk. I'm going to be covering some current hacking law issues and near-term changes that we can expect to hacking laws and policy, mostly in the United States. This is a 25-minute talk slot. I'm going to use just about all of it, but I will be on Discord and Twitter afterwards for Q&A. I'm going to talk kind of fast, throw a lot of information at you. There will be legal information. It's unavoidable. But if you don't get it all, don't worry. The talk will be recorded and you can rewatch it and pour over it later. I know I will. I'm Harley Geiger and Senior Director of Public Policy at Rapid 7. I've been working on legal protections for security researchers pretty directly since about 2013 when I was a congressional staffer and wrote legislation to reform the DMCA and the CFAA. And advocating for security research and the community has been a good chunk of what I do still at Rapid 7, because I believe that this community is critical for pushing improvements to cybersecurity and safety for users. Now, you may be forgiven if you're looking at the title of my talk and feeling indignant, right? Hacking is not always a crime. Well, hacking is not a crime, you might be saying to yourself. But I want you to imagine the government chuckling like Emperor Palpatine and saying, my friends, whether hacking is a crime is up to the government, right? We empower the government to define the laws. So how is that going in 2021 with hacking law? So we're going to check in. Let's check in on the crimes. We're going to look at Section 1201 of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. We're going to look at the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, coordinated vulnerability disclosure policies, state computer crime laws, and a bit on privacy laws as well. So let's kick off the review with the monstrous Section 1201 of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. This law, and forgive me, here comes the lawyer speak, right? But the law forbids circumventing a technological protection measure that controls access to a copyrighted work unless you have the authorization of the copyright owner. So what does that mean for hacking? Well, software is a copyrighted work, and a lot of security research involves exploiting protections like weak encryption or default passwords on software. So that's the circumventing of the technological protection measures. And that puts good faith hackers at risk of being sued by the software vendor for daring to hack without their permission. So, and that is even for devices that you already own, because you don't own the copyright on the software in that device. You are licensing that software. So DMCA, right? It's protecting copyright. Not really. Everyone recognizes that security research does not infringe on copyright. Instead, Section 1201 of the DMCA has really become more of this battleground over those who want to see protections for security research and those who argue that all sorts of apocalyptic things will happen if hackers are not held back by these legal restrictions, right? Live elections will be hacked, cars will be hacked in the highway, planes will be hacked in the air, and other such nonsense that I know that you all would never do. But the hacking protection side has actually made tremendous progress recently. Every 3 years, we assemble before the Copyright Office and we engage in ritual combat with those who would seek to stifle independent security research. And this debate takes place before the Copyright Office. It involves security researchers, businesses, trade associations, the Department of Justice, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, and an exception to Section 1201, this law that you see, paraphrased up there, an exception for security research, protection for security research was born in 2015. 3 years later, it was strengthened in 2018. And now here we are in 2021, and the debate is happening once again. The 3-year cycle has rolled over, and it is ongoing right now, this month, next month. And by the end of the year, by end of 2021, we will have an updated security research protection rule under Section 1201. I estimate around October, we probably see that. Now, the current regulation, I mentioned this protection, the current protection says that hackers don't need permission from software copyright holders if they are conducting their research on something that they have lawfully acquired, right? So it's not stolen, and they're doing it in a way that avoids harm, and they're doing the research just for security purposes. Okay, but also the regulation says that you cannot get your protection under Section 1201 of the DMCA unless you obey every other law and regulation on the entire globe, right? Think about the enormity of that. So that's even obscure ones with no relation at all to security, like the electrical code, broad and vague ones like the CFAA, which we're getting to next, and even non-US laws that apply extraterritorially, like Chinese restrictions on vulnerability disclosure, GDPR, and so forth. And so this phrase does not violate any applicable law, which is ultra broad and really just serves to compound penalties on researchers, chills research. And this phrase is the focal point, one of the focal points for the current rulemaking that is happening right now with the Copyright Office. And believe it or not, in fact, the Department of Justice is on our side with this one. The DOJ recently sent a letter to the Copyright Office asking them to remove this phrase in the applicable law and provide clearer protection for security researchers. I want to also say the DOJ stood up for security researchers in 2018 as well. So they deserve credit for that. So watch out for this later this year. Watch out to see if any applicable law phrase is in the new rule, the new protection for security researchers. And in the meantime, if you or a loved one have had your security research hindered by unclear liability to Section 1201, now is an excellent time to write a letter to the Copyright Office. Next up, the CFAA. You know it, you love it. And can we just take a moment, can we grudgingly admit that the law has problems, right? But a law that prohibits malicious hacking, it might not be a bad idea if the goal is to prohibit malicious hacking. Well, no. So the CFAA says that you cannot access a computer without the authorization of the computer owner, right? Somebody else's computer. And also, if you do have the authorization to access someone else's computer, that you don't exceed the limits of that authorization, right? Like you can watch Netflix on my computer, but don't be looking at my email. And then finally, you cannot damage somebody else's computer without authorization. And you'll notice that I keep saying other people's computer, someone else's computer, and that's the key to the CFAA, right? Unlike the DMCA, which can apply to computers that you own yourself, the CFAA's prohibitions focus on what you can do to computers and servers and other internet-enabled assets that are not yours. But one of the big problems that CFAA poses for ethical hackers is what happens when you violate terms of service on a computer that you are allowed to use, but that you don't own. So like the server of a publicly accessible website or a computer at your school or workplace, right? So for example, what if the terms of service say, no security research on this computer? You may not scrape this website, or you may not publicly disclose any vulnerabilities that you find on our servers, but you can use it for other things, right? So then if you violate the terms of service, does that then become a federal hacking crime? And so why are we talking about this? This has been something that has split US courts for more than a decade. Very smart people come down on either side of this. Some courts say, yes, it's broad, but violating terms of service is a CFAA violation. And other court circuits in the United States say, no, that's insane. What Congress meant to say was that you have to violate terms of service and do something else, like circumvent a technological control or something, get a cease and desist letter, something else. Well, now, this is what's happening now. Now, the Supreme Court is taking up this issue. In the Van Buren case, this is happening this year. If the Supreme Court does not punt on this issue, if they make a clear decision either way, then this will be a very consequential decision for security researchers and really for everybody else that uses computers, which is one or two of us. So if the Supreme Court decides that it is a violation of terms of service, that violating terms of service is a violation of the CFAA, then lots of stuff becomes illegal, right? Lying about your age or your real name on Facebook, or playing video games on your work computer. And of course, security research that violates terms of service. On the other hand, if the Supreme Court says, no, violating terms of service is not a CFAA violation, then that will probably be considered a good thing for security researchers. But government agencies, many companies are going to worry about insider threat problems because a lot of their insiders really are constrained by contractual organizations, employee agreements, as opposed to technological controls. So either way, it's going to cause problems for one community or another. So I predict that if the Supreme Court comes out with this decision, we're going to see a renewed push for legislation in Congress to update the CFAA. I estimate, spitballing that the Supreme Court's opinion will come out in May or June of 2021. So watch for that decision in the Van Buren case. Now, the CFAA, of course, is a federal law. Well, what about the states? Bing. The CFAA gets a lot of attention, and you probably think that the CFAA is bad, but you should check out what the laboratories of democracy have cooked up. Every state has a computer crime law, and they tend to have language similar to the CFAA, right? Prohibiting access without authorization, prohibiting exceeds authorized access, except the states tend to be even more broad and more vague than the CFAA. And I'm going to give you two examples. I'm going to give you an example of one that is problematic and one that is actually pretty good. All right, so Maryland and Washington. So here's an example of a possible problem. Maryland, home of the NSA, says that you may not attempt to identify an access code, right? A valid so it doesn't say what you're going to use that access code for. It doesn't say you have to use it maliciously or as part of a crime. But if you identify it or even attempt to identify this access code without permission, really that's a crime in Maryland. So what if you're a security researcher looking for a weak default password on an IoT device that you own, right? Really? So check out the computer crime laws in your state and then weep unless you live in Washington state. So Washington state has a bona fide carve out for security research. Plus, it makes clear that terms of service violations are not crimes. You can see the carve out for security research there in highlight, the terms of service stuff in bold. Just look at that for a moment. It's beautiful, but it is very much the exception. Since 2019, at least 7 states have proposed expansions to their computer crime laws. And this is probably undercounting. Since 2019, to my knowledge, at least, Virginia and West Virginia have actually passed expansions to their computer crime laws. Here are summaries of those laws. They're not really related to hacking, but the point is that the state versions of the CFAA are growing, not shrinking. And in many cases, these are redundant crimes. Like Virginia already outlaws fraud, but this is a fraud using electronic messages, right? West Virginia already outlaws malware, but here they are piling new penalties and law enforcement authorities onto ransomware, which is awful stuff. But let's face it, the point is these laws, like the CFAA, are not shrinking, right? They're growing. And states pretty much propose new computer crime laws on an ongoing basis. So be on the lookout for that over the coming year. It may be happening in your state. So CFAA gets a lot of attention, but I really recommend that motivated hackers take a look at the status of their states. Onward now to vulnerability disclosure. And here, for the uninitiated, here we are talking about organizations that adopt processes to receive and to respond to vulnerability disclosures from unsolicited sources like hackers and independent security researchers. And coordinated vulnerability disclosure policies are really important because it helps you to work with government, work with companies to disclose vulnerabilities, report them to the public, avoid filthy lawyers like myself, unnecessary conflict and misunderstandings. It's good stuff, right? Well, it's moving right along. Regulatory agencies like the Food and Drug Administration, like the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, have included coordinated vulnerability disclosure in the guidance that they put out to the organizations that they regulate, right? So for example, medical devices and connected cars. So the agencies are starting to incorporate this in their regulations. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, has included coordinated vulnerability disclosure in its NIST cybersecurity framework. And very important, DHS in September of 2020 issued a directive that required all federal agencies to adopt coordinated vulnerability disclosure policies in their internet connected access or assets. So this is in the process of rolling out now over the next year and a half as well. And it's a pretty major change in federal adoption of vulnerability disclosure, right? All the agencies have to have it now. So that gets a smiley face from me because it's a big deal. And in addition to that, in December of 2020, Congress passed the IoT Cybersecurity Improvement Act, which puts a requirement for federal agencies and federal contractors to have vulnerability disclosure processes for their information systems. It's built now into law, not just a DHS directive, right? And the next thing that we can see happening there is that NIST is going to issue guidance on it around May or June of this year. And that will be the guidance that agencies and contractors are supposed to be following with regard to their CVD. So that's a big deal too, right? Federal agencies and contractors for their information systems, not just IoT. Don't let the title fool you. It's for their information systems. It's also a big deal, and so that gets a heart. So in my opinion, the federal government has actually done a pretty remarkable job of leading in this area. So we can hope that the private sector follows suit. Now, internationally, this is also moving ahead. Both the EU and the UK are looking at spreading adoption of coordinated vulnerability disclosure. The EU is considering an update to its Network and Information Systems Security Directive called NIS2. And that would, among many other things, establish a framework for coordinated disclosure in every EU member state. And the UK is considering a requirement that all IoT vendors in the UK that are selling in the UK have a vulnerability disclosure policy in place. So these are still under development, but it is likely that we will see some update on them later this year. And so if they pass, then they get a lightning bolt for being awesome. But I'm going to take away the lightning bolt because it hasn't passed yet. It's something for them to work towards. In my opinion, the growing adoption of coordinated vulnerability disclosures has been, along with Section 1201, pardon me, one of the great success stories of hacking policy over the past 5 years. And now, lastly, but not least, privacy, right? So you all need to keep rapidly evolving privacy laws on your radars. There is good news and bad news when it comes to privacy. So the good news, I think, is that privacy laws usually come with a requirement that personal information be kept secure. All right, so hooray. The bad news is that privacy restrictions can also prohibit the collection and use of personally identifiable information for security research. Now, we usually think of security research as not needing PII. However, the definition of PII in modern privacy laws encompasses things that can be useful for security research, right? Like IP address, domain name, URL, and any other potential identifier of consumers. The California Consumer Privacy Act, GDPR, both cover this sort of information as PII. So let's see, there it is with California. And I know this drives engineers nuts. They say, well, an IP address is public information. And yeah, I get it, but there we are with the PII definition, including IP address. And so the fact remains that if your security research involves, for example, scanning publicly available assets on the internet, potentially sharing IP addresses as part of a vulnerability disclosure, then you need to ensure that your collection and that your sharing of that information is not in violation of privacy restrictions. Now, the good news is also that if you are not sharing that information for profit, you may be okay. These laws also come with partial exceptions for security. But these exceptions for security are usually about defense. They're really not written with security research in mind. So I'm not going to say they don't cover security research, but I will say you have to have an argument about it. Now, the thing to watch in the near term over the coming year is whether more US states adopt privacy legislation and see how they treat security information and personal information that you might need for security research. A lot of states, as you can see here, are considering their own privacy regimes. And I can tell you, I recently looked at Florida's proposal, and it's a mess. Not only are they not adequate on personal data security, they do include IP address as personal information, but their protections for security activity definitely don't easily fit security research or vulnerability disclosure. I don't know whether it'll pass or not, right? All this remains to be seen. But the point is we should really watch what is happening in the States. Now, in the EU, remember earlier I mentioned two things. One, that the GDPR includes IP address in its definition of personal information. It does have a partial exception for security. Well, that NIS2 regulation that I also mentioned earlier is looking to make an update, or at least a clarification to GDPR, saying that vulnerability disclosure, things that are being done for security awareness, should be a legitimate use of PII under GDPR, right? So essentially broadening protections for security research and vulnerability disclosure from GDPR. That is in flux. That is something that's proposed and being discussed right now, and something that we strongly support. Federal legislation in the United States continues to really just be a fever dream. I would really not hold your breath that it'll happen this year. There is, after all, a pandemic to deal with and a Congress that has to, very sharp partisan divide. But because a lot of states do seem very serious about passing a confusing jumble of privacy legislation, this may prompt Congress to get over its inertia and take it up next year, or maybe the year after. And now we know what to look for, right? We want to look for how PII encompasses the things we might need for security research and how security research is protected. Now, a quick recap. DMCA section 1201. Right, really looking for any applicable law restriction, whether it stays or goes, in the new protections for security research. We'll see that hopefully in fall of 2021. Under the CFAA, we're looking out for the Supreme Court's Van Buren decision, which will affect whether or not terms of service violations qualify as federal hacking crimes. We're hoping to see that in May or June of 2021. The states, there are computer crime expansions, right? That is ongoing. So there's not really a set deadline for that, but be on the lookout for it in your state. Coordinated vulnerability disclosure. I think the next major thing to happen in the United States is the implementation of the IoT Cybersecurity Improvement Act. We'll see the next phase of that, I believe, in May or June of 2021. So really quite soon. And then privacy law, also ongoing, right? So how IP address, domain name, URL are used for security purposes. And that's going to depend very much on how the states are rolling this forward. So I will now attempt, probably poorly, to look at Discord and see whether or not there are any questions for me. But I really want to thank you all very much for coming to my talk, for fighting for the users, and thank you to HackerCon for having me. Let's see, let's see here. I'm now looking at Discord. So if there's any questions in the forum, please feel free to paste it so I don't have to scroll and fish around for it. Nothing. I'm probably doing it wrong. All right, well, at any rate, it was wonderful being able to speak, and hit me up on Twitter if you have any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, and we are going to go to a brief break, and the next speaker will be here in the next 10 minutes or so. Thank you again.